Hello everyone and welcome back to Deresley. Quite a few how-tos in part 3 of my diorama build. So I'll start with the tractor barn, which is now finished, all bar some weathering. And then I will show you how I made the walls for the park, the walls with the pillars and railings. After that I'm going to show you an easy and inexpensive way of making flower borders and flower beds. And then I'm going to finish with the war memorial itself and show you the way I've painted it and weathered it. So let's get started. No progress at all this time on the buildings. They are still in the same place, but I have drilled holes in the baseboards to take the lighting wires through. So I have done a little bit of work, but you won't see the results because the buildings are placed over the holes. The other thing I have completed is the making of the replacement tractor shed, which sits on the layout just here, and the little lean-to now that I've made on here now covers the point motor. Now this is the building that it replaced, and although I shan't use this, I think there it can look quite effective. Slightly different rebuild on it, but I like this little area of farm buildings here coming off the front of the layout. These could be stables or something like that. So I think there's potential here for another scratch built building. Obviously when I remove the diorama that'll be permanently fixed to the layout. The tractor barn still needs weathering. So next time I plan to show you how you can weather card models in particular by using watercolour paints. And now a simple way to make walls for Riverside Park using paper, card and plastic. This should be enough of the grey card walling to finish the park. It's one column made of 4 laminations of 2mm grey card and 2 strips of 2mm grey card making the walls, which makes the construction, gives it that sort of shape of the thicker column and the thinner wall. The walls will be capped with some plastic bricks, actually, that again I bought at a model railway show, and they will be cut to length and put on the top of the wall. I've made sure the wall is long enough to take 3 panels of the fencing. Obviously that'll be on top of it. Okay, so the first thing to do then is to take the depth measurement from here, which I think is 9mm, 8mm actually, and cut some strips from the printed sheet. This is from Howard Scenics and it's Victorian red brick. I will mark 8mm marking along the back of the printing. Put a spot there and measure 8mm, and then cut the strip of fencing. The strip of walling, I mean, not the fencing. Cut the strip of walling, and that should fit neatly on the wall. So I'll go ahead and glue that on either side of the 2 wall pieces, and then I'll do a similar thing for the upright and then come back. When the walling is dry, can cut the thin strips of the plastic brickwork which will make the capping for the wall. I can cut it to length. And the final piece of walling which I've cut to fit the edge of the diorama. Now they can both be glued along the top of the wall with the RC Modulus craft glue. That's R/C radio control. So I guess a model radio control shop would be a good place to start to find that. I've had that a while. A bottle like that will last for years. Okay, to make sure nothing moves, a couple of clothes pegs while it's drying. Now the cappings for these vertical blocks of walling can be made from scraps of the 2mm grey card. And that can simply be glued in place. Once the glue has fully dried, I can now fix the fencing, which is plastic, onto the brick cappings there, which are also plastic. So I'm going to fix this with some Tamiya extra thin cement, and it comes with a little brush applicator, and I'm simply going to hold the railings in position along the centre brick and then just put a spot of cement just at the end there, either side, and then for the few moments it takes to dry I'm going to hold the railings vertically in position. Okay, and give that a moment or two. it's very fragile at this stage, but what I'm going to do now is to just position the other end centrally along the plastic capping, and put a spot of the liquid cement there as well, and again hold it in position until that dries. Now I'm going to put a spot in the centre Now as I look at it, I've actually got it positioned across like that instead of like that. It's just slightly skewed. So this cement will loosen the cement here, and I can move that. So I'm going to let the centre part dry fully, and then I'll correct that. This one is a shorter section. Same process. Alright, make sure that's vertical, and then let that dry. Bring this one back. Okay, this is the long part. This is the long strip again. So I'm going to put some adhesive along there, which softens it slightly so that I can move it more centrally. That's better. And the same with that end. I'll just loosen that and place this more centrally. And now I can address the middle and put a longer bead. Once it's in position and I'm happy with it, I can put a bead of cement all along the base there, so that when that dries, that'll be quite solid and it's vertical. Now I'm ready to place these permanently on the diorama. So this area remains to be completed, and that completes the line of fencing that runs all the way around the park that I have on this diorama. You can see I've mounted the gates on their pillars, and all I have to glue on now is this railing strip that you saw me build a moment ago. Just put some of the RC cement. This is glued and fits along here. It looks vertical, that looks okay. So we have one more piece to fit. From this angle you can see the line of the fencing and the gates. It looks really good, I think. This is fixed in position as well, so this is the final bit of the fencing to put in, and it's going to fit in there, and I'll just put the square behind it to keep it in an upright position while it dries. Trying to do this with one hand, but you get the idea. When I take the camera away, I'll just make sure that's vertical as it should be. So next time I'm going to look towards putting the flower beds, and I've got some small trees and things. So now I've got this main structure done, of the areas defined and all the fencing and the gates and the walling and the positioning. Now I can go ahead and finish this entire side of the road here. So what Deresley is going to need in the park is some flower beds and flower borders. So here's a way of making them cheaply, quickly and in quantity. So all you need are some pan scourers. These are Waitrose ones and these are Morrison's, and you'll notice they're both a different shade of green. This is a very dark green, and this is a nice mid-green. You can decide which ones you want to use. I've opened the Morrison's ones, and a single pad looks like this, and it is a uniform thickness of about a scale 80 centimetres, I would think, or 2.5 feet, something like that. So they work well for flower borders, but there's obviously plenty of ways you can cut and use this. So the first thing I'm going to need to make a nice display of roses with the dark leaves here is some acrylic paint, and I'm going to use the Liquitex Cadmium Red Medium. So this is the red straight from the tube, and I'm not going to dip the brush in it as much as dab the brush in with the side like this. Just load it up with paint. Don't dilute it, straight from the tube. And directly on the pad, just as it comes, I'm going to dab it along with this bright red. Okay, don't try and push too hard on it, otherwise you'll fill up the gaps, and you want to give an impression of a mass of flower heads here. So, you know, with a pack of these you could make 5 different flower arrangements, either a single colour like this or multiple colours. Don't skimp on the paint. You want this bright red acrylic to dry with some intensity. If you thin it, it'll look washed out. And there we are, very attractive, I think. Now once that's dry, that can be cut into strips or into flower bed shapes, ready to go onto your railway. I've actually done some, and I've been cutting and playing around with it, and I produced this on a Waitrose scourer, which is fractionally deeper, so I'm inclined to go for the Morrison's ones, because when you compare the two, I do quite like that dark foliage on the plants. I think it looks more convincing. Nonetheless, I've got the red out, and I can, you can add various layers of colour to suggest a border of, or flower bed of varied plants. Okay, you notice this it's got a cutout here, and I mentioned you could make from this sort of border strips, or you can make flower beds. In order to make the strips, all you need is a steel ruler and a sharp knife, a Stanley knife or something similar. But for the curved beds, it's best to source something of a suitable size. And I'm using this Doritos cap. You know, you can imagine different lids of different diameters will give you a nice sort of cutting template, and simply then cut round with the knife, and you can produce circular flower beds or semicircular flower beds. This one, I did it for the size to go against an internal wall in the inside wall around the edge of Deresley, around the edge of the park. And again, we can leave it as it is, or we can add some of the red. So the other thing you can do is to take the edge. It's best to let the top dry actually, so it'd be a lot easier. And then just take a little of this randomly around the edge where the flowers are. You know, they won't all end up in a straight line, and you get rid of a lot of that sort of green strip effect. It makes it look more natural. I'm going to turn to my artist's acrylic paints to paint the War Memorial. Now, the Huntingdon War Memorial has a tiered base like this one, which is also grey. So I'm going to leave the primer grey on that for the moment, and I'm going to paint the main rectangular shape of the plinth. I'll do my mixing on the edge here because the white plate's going to throw the exposure out a little bit. So you won't see this, but I put some white paint on the white plate, and I want the stone colour for the main part of the plinth. So I'm going to put a little bit of the raw umber in. And that's quite nice, but it's a bit, you know, cool. I wanted a little more yellow than that, so I'm going to put a little bit in of the raw sienna. So instead of buying various tins of different stone colours, you know, with a few artist's acrylics and a little bit of thought, you can come up with all manner of greys and warm sort of sandstone colours. So let's just go back to this one, put some white in it to get the tone, and I'm going to put some of the raw sienna in here, and that gives a nice warm tone, I think. And I'm going to use a brush. I'll use a reasonable artist brush to paint these on. Now, one thing you can do when you're working with a little palette of paints like this is you can, you know, I'll pick up a little bit of the raw umber here, and you can add a little bit of a colour variation into the stonework. So if I paint some horizontal lines, it'll suggest sort of horizontal blocks, or at least it'll give it a bit of interest. while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to mix a slightly darker tone of grey for the soldier. Okay, so I'm going to use the Payne's grey and then add some white into that. Now I want this to be darker than the primer grey, so I'll keep adding a little Payne's grey in here, bit at a time, until I'm happy. Don't want it too cloggy, so a little bit more water. And then I'll paint the figure all over. Now this is a statue, so it will be all the same colour. This is covering really well. Just one coat of this should do. I've got to do his feet actually, but I'm going to switch to a smaller brush for that. I may change my mind actually and paint the whole of the base here this dark colour, but see how this goes first of all. This is the War Memorial finished painting, the colours and the design based on the Town War Memorial in Huntingdon. One thing I didn't mention when I was doing the painting sequence is the panel here is lighter, as it is in the Huntingdon example. But again, this was just some of the white and raw sienna or yellow ochre mixed with it to give a paler contrast to the main plinth colour. You'll notice as well that the whole thing has been varnished. It's had two coats of a gloss varnish. Now I've done this for two reasons. First, I'm going to apply some decals or transfers, and secondly I'm going to apply some weathering. So let me just go through the decals, and they are for the names of the fallen during two world wars, and I made in Photoshop a list. You can see two columns, and I reduced them to size, so I've cut them into rectangles ready to apply. I can put this on, slide out the paper, and the glossy finish eliminates any trapped air underneath the decal. It also makes it smooths it to make it easier to position. Once I'm happy with the position, I'll just press it in place. Plastic modellers have long known the usefulness of oil paints for weathering techniques. The big problem with oil paints, however, is that the linseed oil in them is very slow drying. But there is a type of oil paint made by Winsor & Newton called Griffin Alkyds, which replaces the oil with a faster drying alkyd medium. I'm going to paint the weathering on the memorial. For the dark grey figure I'm going to use some black, and for the rest of it, and I might use black actually on the plinth, but for the rest of this I'll use some a dark brown raw umber. I'm using this straight from the tube, so it's quite stiff. I'm not thinning this with anything, although you can thin it with a white spirit or there's a special medium, but this is straight from the tube. So I'm going to put the black on here. You don't have to be too careful with this actually. In this instance I can just coat everything with this black. And I think I'll just run some around the plinth. I know it looks a bit messy. Now I shall clean the brush in white spirit. Having squeezed the brush dry, I will now use some of the raw umber around the top part of the plinth, making sure I get it into every sort of corner, which is the corners, basically the corners between the light coloured print, the light coloured plaque with the names on, and the main plinth. Okay. Now the second part of this process is now to remove that colour. So I'll start with the figure. I'm using a dry paper towel here, but you could have it sort of slightly dampened with some white spirits, but we'll see how it goes, because the idea is just simply to rub over the object, in this case the figure, and the black gets removed from the high spots but remains in all the creases and folds underneath the helmet, etc., and it gives the figure a much more three-dimensional look. It accentuates the light and shade, or the shade in the case of the black. And you take off as much as you can. Now this won't properly dry until tomorrow, and I'm going to publish this video shortly, so I will show you the finished memorial in the next video. Now you see on the light how, you know, if you use vertical strokes, it can suggest sort of the effects of rain. So, you know, with this sort of outdoor stuff that wants a sort of authentic weathering, is just use a vertical wipe and try to get as much off as you can, but be very careful you don't take it all off. You can see how that leaves a sort of a weathered rim or a darkened shadow around the plinth, which just brings it to life a little bit more than would be the case if we just left it with the paint on it. Now I don't want to get paint on my cutting mat, so I'll stand it on a scrap piece of grey card, and then I'm going to do the top surfaces. So I'm going to use the Alkyd Griffin oils again, and I'm going to put a little cobalt blue mixed with some white. It's actually a light blue. But this time I don't want to put the paint on liberally, I want to put it on quite sparingly. So I'm going to wipe most of this off onto my tissue. And then I'm going to use this with vertical strokes just to brush the figure and create some highlights and some weathering across the top. So I'm concentrating more on the upper surfaces, the shoulders, the hat, perhaps the arms or the bottom of the jacket here where it flares out from the waist, and it turns what could look a little bit flat into something that has a lot more three dimensions about it. And I could use this just as a highlighter on the ridges of the steps. Just take some more paint off and just highlight the edges of the steps. So I've got to allow this figure to dry now. The oil paint, although it's Alkyd's, will still take a day or so to dry enough for me to put a matte varnish on it. So I'm going to leave this now until the next update for you to see it in situ. But one thing I am going to show you, I have made a small wreath. I made some copper wire circles, and I used some threads from the scouring pads and painted them like I showed you. I painted the flower beds, and this is finished actually, but I'm thinking of positioning it there on the finished memorial. So I'll show you this next time when I've completed the other little bits I need to do in the memorial area of the park. Well, that's it for this update. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe in the normal way. I have photoshopped in a photo background which I hope enhances the diorama and gives it the realistic look I'm always striving for. So thanks for watching. See you next time.